welcome to the next lesson on evidence for evolution. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at biological change and how we can determine that biological change through things like paleontology, the fossil record, and relative and absolute dating of fossils, as well as types of fossils and the steps in fossilization. So fossilization is a process where an organism or individual's remains are preserved over time, and they're preserved by the hardening of that particular skeleton, or it may be their soft tissue, typically in rocks. The process of fossilization takes place in a number of steps where we have the organism will die, its soft tissue will decay, typically, it will be buried, usually underwater, or quickly buried under some sort of sediment, and that sediment will eventually accumulate. Over time, those bones or hard parts will be replaced by minerals, and then that's the process of fossilization. And then over a period of time, there may be uplift or erosion, and then the discovery of that fossil. So there are a number of types of fossils, and as we know, there are already impressions of prehistoric plants or animals. So you can have impressions where you have the organisms being decayed, as in this picture here. You may have mineralization, where we've had minerals deposited into the structure. You may have traces, so behaviors. So here are worms moving through a particular area of soil, or mummification, where soft tissues are preserved. So the process in which fossilization occurs, the organism must be buried or covered in sediment, and it must happen quickly. If it doesn't happen quickly, it's open for predation or scavengers eating it, and it's open for decay by bacteria. The organism must be free from scavengers, I already mentioned, and it's typically in an oxygen-poor environment. Oxygen-poor environment because oxygen will oxidize or provide the necessary conditions for bacteria to decompose that fossil. Usually underwater is a space where organisms experience low oxygen environments. They also may be stored under peat bogs or swamps. The fossil typically has to be made of hard parts. Typically, hard parts fossilize, such as bones and teeth, better than soft tissues. Not always the case, though. And the minerals typically replace the sediment from natural bone, allowing the remains to become hard and fossilize. So these are the processes or steps we need in order for fossilization to occur. Now, we're going to be dating fossils. So to date a fossil, there are two techniques we can use. We can look at relative dating and absolute dating, and that will tell us obviously an evolutionary history over time. So we know how fossils occur, and now we're going to be able to date these fossils. So relative dating, relative is obviously a word to describe a comparison. The relative tip just describes that the oldest rock will be at the bottom and the youngest rock will be at the top. And absolute gives you a more accurate description, a more quantifiable description of when that particular fossil formed. So relative dating, in its process, it can use stratigraphy, where you look at the relative position of the rock to describe its age. Of course, it's relative dating, so it's relative. The lower the stratum, as in this one here, the older it is, and the younger the stratum, the higher it is. Obviously, rocks will deposit over time, so therefore the ones at the top will have deposited last. Therefore, the rocks and fossils in there will be younger compared to these ones here. We can also use index fossils. So index fossils are fossils which appear in two different locations, two different geographical locations, but they have the same age. And we can use those to compare which strata are of the same age and which fossils will fall into the same category. Absolute dating, as I've already described, gives a more precise and accurate measure of age, but it's not an exact date. There is, of course, a limitation of this. One of the most common types of absolute dating is called radiometric dating. That's used radioactive isotopes. So in atmosphere, there are a number of isotopes, which are just forms of elements that are radioactive. One of them is carbon-12. Now, carbon-12 will decay or its form will break into nitrogen-14 over time. Each time carbon breaks down or decays, it will form nitrogen-14, as I already mentioned. And the number of years that it takes to decay can be used to approximate the age of the fossil. So we know that carbon-14 will decay at 5,730 years. So at the beginning, we have 100% of carbon. 14 in the organism. When the organism dies, the carbon-14 quantity will start to decay or break down. After 5,730 years, the amount of carbon-14 will be 50% what it began as. And obviously the amount of nitrogen-14 will be 50% from what it began as at 0. And then over time, 11,460, 17,190, etc., etc., we can look at the number of half-lives, that's what these are called here, number of half-lives that have occurred, which can be used to approximate the age of that particular fossil. So if a fossil has 6.25% or 12.5% carbon-14 remaining, it will suggest that it is 3 or 4 half-lives or even 5 half-lives old, which will be this number of years. Absolute dating has a number of radioactive isotopes that are used, the most common of which is carbon-14. However, the limitation is carbon-14 dating can be used up to 50,000 years. Beyond that point, it becomes an inaccurate measure of the age dating. Potassium-argon dating is another form of half-life dating, and that has a much larger time scale, which it can be used. So there are two other types of absolute dating techniques, thermoluminescence and electron spin resonance. If you're interested, you can investigate these further. This diagram here just shows how carbon-14, there's a sample, 10 grams of it, and over time it will decay, and each time will decay by half. So after 5,730 years, we'll have 5 grams left, and then another 5,730 years, we'll have 2.5, 1.25, etc., etc. The reason that carbon-14 decays over time is it's produced in the atmosphere, it forms carbon dioxide, it's taken up by the plants, which the organisms will eat, and those organisms will have a certain amount of carbon-14. But once they have died, obviously they're not going to be eating anymore, so that carbon-14 will be decaying and proportion will decrease, which is why we can use this to help approximate the life of the fossil or the age of the fossil. These are the ideas you need to be able to understand, and these are the key terms. You should assess your knowledge and your understanding of this lesson using the success criteria, where you need to explain the process and requirements for fossilization and for dating fossils, both relative and absolute, and the concept of a half-life, what it means. Thanks for watching.